So here's the story of the Birtley Belgians and the village where the young Ida de Gent married her soldier fiancé, Edward Coulemans. In the spring of 1915, the news came to Britain of the great shell shock. The army was so short of ammunition, orders were given to the guns to fire no more than 4 or 5 shells a day at the enemy. The government began building new arms factories, and more than 4,000 war-wounded Belgian soldiers and their refugee families came to Birtley in north-east England. A new village was built to house them and named Elizabethville after the Queen of the Belgians. The factory was built and production started in the summer of 1916. In 2 years, 2 million shells went to the battlefront and helped to save the day and win the war. Elizabethville, with its 7,000 people, was the largest community of Belgian exiles in the world at the time. Its unique life as a Belgian village lasted just 3 years. Soon after returning to his home at Serang near Liège, Camille Fabry wrote their story in 1919, but his book was unknown in Britain, and today there are only a few copies in Belgian archives, so the story of the exiles was lost for 60 years until the mid-1980s, and only in the last 10 years has it been discovered once again. The village was completely self-contained, governed by Belgians, with Belgians managing the factory. Separate from the English village of Birtley, it was surrounded by a high fence and the gates manned by Belgian gendarmes. To enter or leave you had to have a special pass. The single men lived in barracks and the families had quite comfortable cottages with electricity and bathrooms, something few English workers had in those days. There were dining halls, a social club and a theatre. General stores and food shops were opened. Ida de Gent worked in the butchers. There was even a Belgian brewery. The Catholic community built a church, St Michael's, where Ida and Edward married on a cold snowy day in March 1917. More than 80 weddings took place in this church and nearly 300 babies were baptised. Sadly, there were also nearly 80 funerals. Ursuline nuns taught the children in the village school, where the teaching must have been good, for later one of them became a professor at Durham University, and a Belgian girl went home to be head of the technical college at Ayscott. The work in the factory was hard and dirty. Men worked 12 hours a day, only resting on Sunday. Many were injured at their work and some of them killed. The people formed many clubs. There were swimming and football teams, the fanfare brass band and orchestra, several theatrical troupes. Money was raised for soldiers' funds by these entertainers, money which made their lives in the trenches a little more comfortable. Once the war ended, the first men went home on November the 18th, and by early February 1919 the village was empty and the works closed down until war came again in 1939. And what remains of the Belgians today? There's a cemetery, where around 80 of them are buried, among them 17 soldiers. All that remains of the village buildings is the old grocery shop, now used as a motor repair garage. Still standing after nearly 100 years, I reckon it's the oldest prefabricated building in Europe. And if you know where to look, there is still a bit of old iron fence, standing like a sentinel at the old entrance to the village. Recently an apartment block has been built and named Flanders Court, so there's still something to remind people that there's of those heroes from Belgium. The factory was finally demolished last year and the site now lies waiting for new housing development, hopefully with roads named to commemorate the Belgians. There is now a growing network of Belgian and British descendants of these heroic people, which is how I came to meet Roland Burgess. The network brings me new stories nearly every day. These stories are building what Fabry had hoped for a century ago when he wrote, "My book gives a true picture of how admirable were the efforts of our war-disabled soldiers in the land of their exile. I just hope my work collecting these stories will keep alive the memory of those Birtley Belgians." Now settle down and hear the story of Ida and Edward, a Romeo and Juliet love story which began in such troubled times.